The fate of all Western civilization was decided on one hot day by two men who knew each other only through stories. The two greatest commanders of antiquity clashed in a deadly duel, where one would forever fade into obscurity and the other would rise to the pinnacle of glory. Rome, exhausted by years of humiliating defeats, finally fielded a worthy opponent against its worst nightmare. This was not just a battle for territory or resources. It was a battle for the right to dictate history for the next few centuries. The stakes were so high that the losing side risked disappearing from the face of the earth as a political force. On that day, the Roman legion had to prove that it was capable of learning from its mistakes and surpassing its most formidable teacher. Watch the video to the end to find out how Scipio Africanus used Hannibal's genius against him, turning his main weapon into the instrument of his own defeat. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of Roman resilience? The Romans took the defeat at Cannae as a blow that could have destroyed any other power, but it was at this moment that their amazing will to survive manifested itself. They lost a huge number of soldiers, but they did not allow despair to destroy the foundations of the state. Politicians and commanders understood that they had no right to weakness because the enemy was at their doorstep. This cruel reality forced Rome to look at itself in a new way. The Romans did not simply survive the defeat at Cannae, they turned this national trauma into fuel for the creation of a new military machine. The young Publius Cornelius Scipio was one of the few who survived that terrible slaughter. He saw how the experienced Roman legions literally disappeared under the onslaught of the Carthaginian cavalry and maneuvers. For the young officer, this was not just a shock, but a lesson he remembered for the rest of his life. For the first time, he realized how dangerous an enemy capable of thinking outside the box could be. The young Publius Cornelius Scipio saw with his own eyes how the Carthaginian genius destroyed superior forces. He understood that Hannibal did not simply command an army, but played with the enemy on several levels at once. His decisions were quick, flexible, and based on a precise understanding of the enemy's weaknesses. Scipio saw how Roman straightforwardness clashed with cunning that they could not resist. This clash of worldviews had a profound impact on his future. He did not break under the weight of what he saw, but began to methodically study the enemy's tactics, breaking down each of Hannibal's moves into its components. He talked to veterans who had observed the Carthaginians' actions and gathered many small details. For him, every detail mattered because it was these little things that made up the enemy's superiority. He analyzed the positioning of troops, the use of cavalry, and even how Hannibal used the terrain. The deeper he delved into what was happening, the clearer the picture became. Scipio realized that the old Roman straightforwardness no longer worked against the flexible and cunning mind of the Carthaginian. For a long time, the Romans had relied on strength and training, confident that discipline would always prevail. But Cannae showed that steadfastness alone was sometimes not enough. Scipio decided that reforms should affect not only weaponry, but also the very philosophy of warfare. This realization became the starting point for a major military rethinking. He realized that to defeat a monster, one must adopt its habits, but use them with Roman discipline. He sought to combine the cunning of the enemy with the order and precision inherent in the Romans. His view of war became more flexible, which was rare for Roman commanders of the time. Scipio saw how important it was to be able to change plans depending on the situation. He created an army capable of thinking and acting independently. It took years to reform the legions, to teach them to maneuver and think differently on the battlefield. He gave his soldiers tasks that required not only strength, but also intelligence. His training included complex maneuvers that allowed the legion to quickly change its formation. Soldiers learned to act not according to a template, but according to the situation, which made them more dangerous opponents. These were new legions, capable of responding to any surprise. Scipio trained his men not for head-on collisions, but for complex tactical maneuvers that had previously seemed impossible. He taught them how to interact between individual units so that the army's movements would be smooth and coordinated. The centurions began to understand that the battlefield was not a straight line, but a living organism. They learned to anticipate the enemy's intentions and quickly reorganize. All this created a completely different level of training. He introduced new principles of command, where each centurion understood the overall plan and could act according to the situation. This gave the army a flexibility that it had previously lacked. Lower-level commanders ceased to be mere executors and became participants in the overall strategy. This system made it possible to avoid disasters such as Cannae. The Roman army became a more intellectual instrument. Roman society, usually conservative, gave the young general carte blanche, realizing that the old methods were leading to a dead end. The Romans saw that defeat could be repeated if decisive steps were not taken. Therefore, they began to trust Scipio, despite his youth. He became a symbol of change that could lead the state out of crisis. His name was associated with hope for a new future. Scipio became the embodiment of new hope, a man who was not afraid to break with tradition for the sake of victory. He went to Africa not as a plunderer, but as a strategist who understood that victory over Carthage must be precise and decisive. His actions made a strong impression on the local population and his enemies. The Carthaginian Senate saw his confidence and successes as a threat. This is what made them bring Hannibal back home. This set the stage for the final act of this great drama, where the student was preparing to challenge his teacher. Scipio understood that in order to win, he would have to face the greatest commander of his time. He knew that the fate of the entire conflict was at stake. The psychological pressure was enormous, but it did not break him. On the contrary, it only strengthened his resolve. Scipio knew that Hannibal was not defeated as long as he was alive and commanded the army. He did not allow himself to relax for a moment, because he understood that the enemy would not repeat the same mistakes. He carefully studied Hannibal's every move to anticipate his plans. These observations helped him make his own decisions. This is how the strategy for future victory was born. The psychological pressure on the Roman commander was enormous, because any mistake could undo all his achievements. He understood his responsibility to Rome, which had entrusted him with the final say in this struggle. But it was this tension that made him stronger and more focused. He learned to keep a cool head even in moments of extreme danger. This state of mind became part of his strength. But it was this pressure that forged him into a new type of commander. Scipio became a man who combined Roman discipline with deep strategic thinking. He was able to see the entire battlefield and assess the situation instantly. This ability gave him an advantage over those who relied solely on strength or experience. He understood that victory required flexibility. He understood that the upcoming battle would not be just a clash of soldiers, but a battle of intellects. Hannibal was a master of surprises, but Scipio had his own surprises in store. He sought to create conditions where his army could exploit all its advantages. This made the upcoming battle particularly tense and unpredictable. Scipio prepared for it with incredible thoroughness. Scipio was preparing to counter Carthaginian cunning with his own, honed by years of analysis. He took every detail into account, from the disposition of troops to the behavior of allies. He worked with the command to create a unified system of action. This allowed him to look confidently to the future. He knew that victory was possible if everything was done precisely. I'm very interested to hear your opinion. Do you think Rome could have won if Scipio hadn't studied Hannibal's tactics at Cannae? Write about it in the comments. And be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the analysis of other great confrontations.
It seems there is nothing left to discuss, Hannibal. We meet on the field.
Are you ready to learn the truth about what the greatest enemies said to each other before the battle? Historians still argue about what exactly Hannibal and Scipio discussed during their legendary personal meeting before the battle. It was a unique moment in history when two commanders who had kept the entire Mediterranean in suspense met face to face without weapons. They looked at each other with undisguised respect, understanding the magnitude of their opponent's personality. Hannibal, already elderly and wise with experience, tried to negotiate peace to save Carthage from complete ruin. He spoke of the fickleness of fortune, reminding the Roman that luck could turn at any moment. Hannibal offered to allow Carthage to retain its African possessions in exchange for renouncing all its overseas territories. It was an attempt to steer the conflict into diplomatic channels using his authority. He saw in Scipio a reflection of himself, a young and ambitious wolf, as he had been many years ago. Scipio, feeling the power of the renewed Roman army behind him, was unyielding and cold. He reminded Hannibal of Carthage's treachery and the peace treaties that had been broken earlier. For Rome, there were no more half measures. Only complete surrender or a decisive battle would do. Scipio made it clear that the time for compromise was over, and that only weapons would speak now. This meeting revealed the gulf between two worlds and two eras. Hannibal represented the passing world of Hellenistic lone heroes, while Scipio represented the relentless machine of Roman state will. Both understood that this conversation was merely a formality before the inevitable storm. They parted without shaking hands, but fully convinced of the strength of their opponent. Each returned to his camp to give his final orders before the battle that would determine the fate of the world. Soldiers from both armies saw this meeting from afar, and it only heightened the tension before the battle. The silence between the two armies was as tense as a bowstring, ready to snap at any moment. The air trembled with anticipation as thousands of people prepared for the clash. It was a moment of truth when diplomacy gave way to brute force. The decisions made in those moments could no longer be changed. The fate of thousands of people now depended solely on the tactical skills of two commanders. History rarely gives us such cinematic moments when the main antagonists look each other in the eye. This episode became a symbol of the end of an entire era of the Punic Wars. Do you think Hannibal could have really prevented the battle with words? In the next chapter, you will learn what living weapon Hannibal planned to use to crush the Roman legions.
Hold the line! Prepare the elephants! Advance!
Guess what happened next when 80 living tanks were brought onto the field? Hannibal bet on a striking force that Rome had never had before: war elephants. These were not just animals, but specially trained machines of destruction designed to break through dense infantry formations. 80 giants lined up in front of the Carthaginian army, creating a wall of living flesh and tusks. The calculation was simple: shock and awe would break the will of the Romans before hand-to-hand combat even began. At that time, elephants served as heavy equipment, sweeping away everything in their path. Their appearance, smell, and trumpeting caused panic among horses and terror among unprepared infantrymen. Hannibal hoped that the Roman formation would crumble at the mere sight of this formidable force. He planned to launch a frontal attack that would disorganize the legions and allow his infantry to finish off the survivors. However, these giants also had their weaknesses, which experienced commanders were well aware of. Elephants were unpredictable, and in their rage could trample their own soldiers just as badly as their enemies. Controlling such a mass required tremendous skill from the drivers sitting on their necks. Hannibal understood the risk, but the situation called for decisive measures and the use of all his trump cards. The Romans, taught by the bitter experience of previous encounters, no longer felt paralyzing fear. Scipio did a tremendous job of psychologically preparing his soldiers to face these monsters. The legionaries knew that an elephant was just a big target that could be frightened or killed. Special weapons were prepared to fight the giants: loud trumpets, torches, and javelins. The light infantry, the velites, were to meet the elephants with a hail of projectiles, aiming at their vulnerable spots. The task was not so much to kill the animals as to enrage them and force them to turn back. It was a dangerous game, where one mistake could lead to disaster for the entire Roman army. Scipio understood perfectly well that the outcome of the battle depended largely on how this first phase went. He turned the fight against the elephants into a controlled technological process. Instead of panic, the Roman ranks were filled with focused readiness to carry out the plan. Every soldier knew his maneuver and his role in neutralizing the threat. It was a triumph of reason and discipline over brute natural power. Hannibal hoped for chaos, while Scipio prepared order and structure. The clash of these two philosophies was to begin with an attack by the Grey Giants. And it was this moment that would show how well the Romans had learned the lessons of the past. Like this if you enjoy analyzing historical tactics.
By the
Want to know a secret that will change your understanding of military geometry? Scipio came up with an ingenious yet risky plan to neutralize Hannibal's elephants. He broke with the centuries-old tradition of forming the Roman legion in a checkerboard pattern, which was used to create a solid front. Instead, he lined up the maniples strictly one behind the other, creating corridors through the entire depth of his army. These corridors were deliberately left empty, turning the formation into a kind of wide-toothed comb. From the outside, these passages were not visible, as they were covered by light infantry, velites. To a Carthaginian observer, the Roman formation appeared monolithic and dense. It was a classic military ruse: show the enemy what he wants to see, while concealing the real situation. Scipio had turned his army into a complex system of traps and channels. The plan was for the elephants, instinctively choosing the path of least resistance, to rush into these open corridors. Instead of crashing into a dense wall of shields, the animals were supposed to rush through the formation without damaging the main forces. And there, inside these corridors, they would be met with crossfire from spears and arrows. This required iron discipline from the soldiers, who had to stand still while the enraged giants rushed past them. Any wrong move, any attempt to close ranks could lead to tragedy. The legionnaires had to trust their commander and his plan more than their own instinct for self-preservation. Scipio also ordered the trumpeters to hide behind the front lines of the army. At the right moment, they were to create an unbearable noise that would frighten the animals. The combination of a visual trap and a sound attack was an innovative approach to warfare. In this way, the Roman commander turned the enemy's strength into its weakness. The inertia and power of the elephants worked against them, forcing them to flee to where they were useless. Scipio did not build a wall against the flow. He built a channel to divert the flow to the side. This tactical maneuver has entered all military history textbooks as an example of unconventional thinking. It showed that victory is achieved not only by force of arms, but also by the correct organization of space. Scipio outmaneuvered Hannibal at the stage of deploying forces, depriving him of his main trump card. Preparations for receiving the elephants were complete, and the trap awaited its prey. The Roman army froze, turning into a deadly maze. Everything depended on whether Hannibal would fall for this trick. How often do you use unconventional solutions in difficult situations? In the next chapter, you will find out whether Scipio's daring plan worked. The battle began with a deafening signal that shattered the silence of the African plain. At Hannibal's command, the drivers drove the elephants forward toward the Roman positions. The earth shook beneath the feet of thousands of soldiers as the gray avalanche began to move, gathering speed. This was the moment of truth for Scipio's entire plan and a test of his soldiers' nerves. But the Romans did not wait silently for the blow. At Scipio's signal, hundreds of trumpets and horns sounded simultaneously. The sharp, piercing sound struck the sensitive ears of the animals, causing them to panic and become disoriented. Some of the elephants, frightened by the noise, immediately turned around and rushed toward their own flanks, where Hannibal's Numidian cavalry was standing. Those animals that continued to move forward encountered unexpected resistance from the velites. The light infantry showered them with a hail of javelins, aiming at their tender skin and eyes. Pain and noise drove the elephants forward, but they sawed a way out of this hell and found it in the empty corridors. Scipio's plan worked like clockwork. The animals rushed into the passages between the maniples. They rushed through the Roman formation without harming the heavy infantry standing at the edges of these corridors. Legionnaires, hidden behind large shields, stabbed the passing beasts with spears and swords. The elephants, which were supposed to trample the Roman formation, became running targets. They flew through and emerged at the rear of the Roman army, where special units were already waiting to finish them off or drive them away. Carthage's main weapon of attack was neutralized in a matter of minutes with minimal losses for Rome. It was a triumph of Roman engineering and tactical training. What should have been a disaster turned into a controlled passage of enemy forces through their own lines. Hannibal saw his bet on brute force defeated by intelligence and discipline. Chaos reigned on the Carthaginians' left flank. where their own elephants crushed the cavalry formation. Massinissa, commander of the Numidian cavalry on the Roman side, seized the moment and delivered a crushing blow. The Carthaginian flank began to collapse even before the main infantry forces entered the battle. Scipio calmly watched as the first stage of the battle ended in complete victory for his plan. Now that the elephants had been removed from the board, the infantry battle began. The field was cleared for a clash of men, where combat technique meant more than size. The danger had passed, but ahead stood an army of veterans who were not accustomed to retreating. The battle was only gaining momentum, entering a phase of exhausting confrontation. Both sides were regrouping for the main strike. Are you ready for the shocking truth about how Hannibal used his men as expendable? He understood that the Battle of Zama was his only chance to change the course of the war, and he was willing to sacrifice those he considered less valuable. He had long been accustomed to making cruel decisions, for the journey through the Alps had taught him that the weak perish first. His strategy was based on cold calculation, not sentiment. Therefore, he employed tactics that many would consider inhumane. After the elephants' attack failed, the infantry went into battle, and here Hannibal used echelon tactics. He knew that elephants could wreak havoc, but relying on them did not always pay off. When the animals failed to destroy the Roman formation, he moved on to the next stage of his plan. He distributed his forces so that each line performed a separate task. This allowed him to control the course of the battle. His first line consisted of mercenaries, Gauls, Ligurians, and Balearics, men fighting for gold. These warriors were fierce but undisciplined. They were accustomed to sudden attacks but did not hold their formation well. Hannibal saw them as a tool for the first wave of pressure. He wanted them to take the brunt of the attack and force the Romans to expend their strength. Hannibal had no illusions about their resilience and planned to use them to wear down the Romans. He understood that the Roman hastati, young and energetic, were capable of withstanding such a battle. Therefore, the mercenaries had to inflict damage, but not necessarily survive. The longer they delayed the Romans, the better for him. It was a calculation based on exhausting the enemy. Scipio, on the other hand, threw his gastati forward, the first line of the legion, young and energetic fighters. They were prepared for the first violent clashes and knew how to regroup instantly. Their armor was stronger and their discipline was much higher than that of the mercenaries. The Romans maintained order even under heavy pressure. This was their key advantage in the early stages of the battle. The collision of the two walls of shields was terrifying in its power and force. The blows of swords and spears created a dull, rhythmic noise that echoed across the field. People on both sides fought in cramped conditions, with almost no room to maneuver. Every step was difficult, and every blow could be the last. It was the beginning of a long meat grinder. The mercenaries understood that they had nowhere to retreat, as behind them stood a second line of Carthaginians ready to kill deserters. Hannibal's order was harsh, but he knew that otherwise this line could fall apart. The mercenaries felt this pressure and fought desperately. Their fear worked in favor of the Carthaginian commander, intensifying the onslaught. But such cruelty had its consequences. Hannibal cynically placed his citizens in the second line so that they would prevent the mercenaries from fleeing and would only enter the battle themselves as a last resort. Carthaginian citizens were more valuable soldiers with better training. He wanted to save them for the decisive moment. Therefore, they had to hold their positions and maintain order. This created tremendous pressure on the front line. This created tremendous pressure in the area where the armies met. The mercenaries felt trapped, but this is what made them fight to the last. The Romans felt the fury of these men and had to hold their formation especially tightly. Neither side could retreat without risk. This made the battle even more brutal. The Roman hastati pressed the mercenaries, using their advantage in weaponry and discipline. They advanced slowly but surely, step by step. Their shields formed a mobile wall that was almost impossible to break through. The gladiuses worked quickly and accurately. This methodical approach gave the Romans an advantage. The short gladiuses worked effectively in close combat, delivering stabbing blows from behind large shields. The mercenaries, accustomed to broad swords, could not turn around. They found themselves locked in narrow spaces where their fighting style lost its power. The Romans took advantage of this, pushing the enemy forward. The mercenaries began to lose their formation. The mercenaries began to retreat, seeking refuge with the second line of their own troops. They hoped to slip through the ranks of their fellow citizens to regroup. But instead of support, they were met with cold calculation. This was the moment when the situation spiraled out of control. The retreating troops threw the formation into chaos. But then something unexpected happened. The second line of Carthaginians refused to let the retreating soldiers pass, raising their spears. They were following Hannibal's orders, not allowing the mercenaries to disrupt their order. The mercenaries ran into an impenetrable wall of spears. Their despair turned into panic. This was the beginning of a massacre among their own ranks. The slaughter among their own began when the mercenaries tried to break through the ranks of the Carthaginian citizens. Those standing in the second line could not retreat, otherwise they would have violated their orders. The mercenaries, on the other hand, acted without order, putting pressure on their own allies. In this melee, there was no difference between friend and foe. It was the chaos the Romans had been waiting for. It was chaos that seemed to play into Rome's hands. But Hannibal calmly watched the events unfold. He understood that this was an inevitable part of his plan. He sacrificed those he considered expendable to delay the Romans. It was important for him to save his best forces for the decisive blow. Such coolness made him a dangerous opponent. He sacrificed pawns to keep his main forces fresh for the decisive blow. The veterans were to enter the fray when the Romans had exhausted most of their strength. He waited for the moment when the exhausted Romans would be unable to offer proper resistance. This approach was cruel, but strategically justified. This is how Hannibal won many battles in Italy. Scipio saw that his front line was bogged down in blood and bodies, losing its formation and strength. He understood that delay could be fatal. Therefore, he prepared to bring in the next line of troops. His task was to balance the losses and maintain pressure. He acted cautiously but decisively. He had to bring in the principals, the second line of experienced legionaries, to increase the pressure. These soldiers were older and stronger than the Gastati. They knew how to take a hit and maintain order in more difficult situations. Their appearance in the center added power to the Romans. Now they could advance further. The battle turned into a slow grinding of manpower, where every meter of land was paid for with hundreds of lives. People fell in rows, and no one could predict the outcome. The battlefield resembled a seething cauldron of sound, blood, and fear. The Romans continued to press forward, even though their strength was running out, but they knew they had to hold out at all costs. It was a moment of tactical pause as both sides caught their breath before the final act. The illusion of imminent victory could prove fatal for Rome. Do you agree that the end justifies the means in such a war? In the next chapter, you will find out who was waiting for the Romans in Hannibal's third line.
Centurions, widen the ranks! Extend the line!
The decisive moment of the battle came when the weary Romans faced Hannibal's third line. This line was not just another echelon, but the very heart of Carthaginian power. The Romans had already broken through 2 layers of defense, expending a tremendous amount of energy and strength. Their armor was covered in dust and sweat, and their breathing became labored with each blow. And now, standing before them, were men who had lived through generations of war and knew how to maintain order better than anyone else in the Mediterranean. These were his veterans, the old guard who had marched with him across Italy, from the Alps to Cannes. These soldiers had known Hannibal's path from the very beginning and were considered the best in his army. They had participated in the most dangerous maneuvers, endured the most difficult campaigns, and saved the day more than once at critical moments. Each of them could name dozens of episodes where their steadfastness decided the outcome of a battle. Their presence on the battlefield always instilled fear in the enemy. These men knew no defeat. They were personally loyal to Hannibal and had tremendous combat experience. Their self-confidence was combined with absolute trust in their commander. They believed that if they went into battle with him, victory would surely be theirs. Hundreds of battles had made them almost psychologically impenetrable. This confidence gave them the strength to hold out until the very end. These were the elite of the ancient world. Warriors for whom war was a profession and a way of life. They did not simply follow orders. They lived for battle every day. Their training was superior to that of most armies of the era. These soldiers knew how to move almost instinctively, anticipating the enemy's actions. It was precisely these fighters that Hannibal placed in the most responsible positions. Scipio, assessing the threat, did what no one expected in the heat of battle. He saw that a direct advance would lead to the destruction of his center. The decision had to be made instantly, and he made a choice that required tremendous courage. Instead of continuing to press the enemy, he stopped the legions. This order shocked even his own soldiers, but they trusted him. Instead of throwing his men into an attack out of inertia, he ordered them to halt the advance. This allowed the Romans to catch their breath for a few moments. Thanks to this, they were able to restore order in their ranks and rebuild their formation. Scipio understood that without this, the entire center of his army would collapse. This pause became a turning point. He brought out the flanking units of Principes and Triarii, placing them in line with the Hastati. The Roman veterans, accustomed to attacking only in extreme situations, now found themselves on the main line. Their experience was supposed to compensate for the fatigue of the young soldiers. This decision created a unified, solid front. Now the Romans were ready to take on the old guard. The Roman front was lengthened to avoid being outflanked by the numerically superior veterans. The simultaneous reorganization made Hannibal's attacks less effective. He could no longer crash into the edge of the front, crushing it and getting behind it. The expansion of the line deprived him of his most dangerous maneuver. Scipio's tactical flexibility saved his army. The two walls, Roman and Carthaginian, collided in a final, terrible blow. It was the moment when the fate of entire eras was decided. Metal clanged, shields cracked, and men fought almost beyond the limits of human capability. The battlefield turned into a narrow corridor of death, and no one thought of retreating. Neither side had an advantage in maneuverability. It was a pure test of strength of spirit and body. No cunning or trickery could help here. Hannibal's veterans pressed forward with force and fury, while the Romans responded with iron resolve. It was a battle where the winner would be the one who could withstand the hellish tension the longest. Such moments are rare in history. Hannibal's veterans fought with fury, knowing that this was their last battle. They knew that behind them stood not just an army, but the fate of Carthage. They felt the breath of their homeland behind them. This gave them the strength to go forward, despite their fatigue and wounds. Their blows became more and more desperate. The Romans held on with their last ounce of strength, countering the enemy's experience with their iron discipline. They understood that there was nowhere to retreat because Scipio and all their honor stood behind them. Their formation wavered, but did not break. Every effort was at the limit of human capabilities. The Romans knew that to hold out meant to win. While the infantry bled in the center, a drama unfolded on the flanks, hidden from view. The Roman and Numidian cavalry under the command of Laelius and Massinissa pursued the fleeing Carthaginian cavalry. Many feared that they would get carried away with the chase and not return, as was often the case in ancient battles. But Scipio had agreed in advance with his commanders on strict discipline. Having dealt with the enemy horsemen, the allied cavalry stopped the pursuit and turned their horses around. They heard the noise of battle behind them and realized that their comrades needed help. Thousands of hooves struck the ground, raising clouds of dust as the horsemen rushed back to the battlefield. Their appearance behind Hannibal's army was the moment that decided the outcome of the war. Hannibal's veterans, fighting the Roman infantry, suddenly heard a rumbling behind them. The cavalry strike from behind was devastating and demoralizing. It was a classic hammer and anvil tactic, one that Hannibal himself had used at Cannae. Now Scipio used it against its creator, closing the circle of encirclement. The Carthaginian infantry found itself trapped between a wall of Roman shields and the attacking cavalry. The veterans' formation, which had seemed unshakable, began to crumble under the double blow. They could not fight on two fronts at once. The panic they had sown for years now gripped their own ranks. Massinissa, wanting to regain his kingdom, fought with particular ferocity, leading the Numidians into the attack. The Roman legionaries, feeling supported, found a second win and intensified their assault. The ring tightened, leaving no chance of escape. Hannibal, seeing that the battle was lost, realized that further resistance would only lead to the senseless slaughter of his best men. The great tactician himself fell into a trap he could not have foreseen. His genius proved powerless against the coordinated work of all branches of the Roman army. The surrounded veterans continued to fight, but it was already agony. Rome's victory was inevitable and final. Scipio closed the circle, putting an end to many years of confrontation. History had come full circle. The encirclement tactic that had made Carthage famous had become the cause of its downfall. The Romans proved themselves to be excellent students. The battlefield at Zama became the grave of Carthage's military power. When the dust settled, it became clear that the Carthaginian army had ceased to exist. The field was littered with the bodies of more than 20,000 Carthaginians, and just as many were taken prisoner. The Romans lost significantly fewer men, confirming the effectiveness of Scipio's tactics. Hannibal, with a small detachment of horsemen, managed to break out of the encirclement and flee to Hadrumetum. For the great commander, it was the collapse of his entire life. The man who had sworn to hate Rome forever was forced to admit his complete defeat. He returned to Carthage not as a triumphant hero, but as a messenger of doom, calling for immediate peace. The Roman legionaries rejoiced, hailing Scipio as a new god of war. They had done the impossible, defeated the undefeated. Scipio, however, showed restraint, understanding the historical significance of the event. The victory at Zama meant not just military success, but a complete change in the geopolitical map. Carthage, which had dominated the Mediterranean for centuries, was broken forever. It lost its fleet, its army, and its right to pursue an independent foreign policy. Scipio dictated the terms of peace from a position of absolute power. Carthage had to pay a huge indemnity and surrender all its war elephants. But most importantly, the proud city could no longer wage war without Rome's permission. Hannibal, showing political wisdom, himself persuaded his fellow citizens to accept these harsh conditions. He understood that the alternative would be the complete destruction of the city. Thus, the military confrontation ended in political subjugation. Rome proved its ability to survive and defeat even the most formidable enemies. The republican system proved to be stronger than the genius of one man. Zama became a symbol of the triumph of Roman organization and perseverance. Scipio returned to Rome a hero, receiving the honorary nickname Africanus. His triumph was perhaps the most grandiose in the history of the city. He saved his homeland and gave it the future of an empire. The echoes of the Battle of Zama resounded for centuries. Rome became the sole master of the Mediterranean. The era of the Punic Wars ended, and the era of Roman domination began. The Battle of Zama was a turning point in ancient history. It was a clash between the two greatest military minds of their time, and the fate of entire nations depended on its outcome. A defeat for Rome could have led to Carthage becoming the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. But the Roman victory changed the balance of power for centuries to come. It was here that the fate of the Second Punic War was decided. If Hannibal had won, the world today might look completely different. Carthage, with its wealth and naval power, could have extended its influence far to the north. Roman culture might not have become the foundation of Europe, and the role of leader would have passed to the trading oligarchy of Carthage. Many institutions that we take for granted would have developed differently, but history chose Rome's side. Rome's victory paved the way for the creation of a global empire that shaped the development of Western civilization. After Zama, the Romans felt confident in their model of government and their military structure. They saw that they could defeat even the most dangerous opponents. This gave them the determination to continue their expansion. Thus, Rome moved from defensive tactics to a confident policy of conquest. The Roman tactics perfected by Scipio became the standard for centuries to come. He managed to combine the discipline of the legions with the flexibility he had observed in Hannibal. His approach demonstrated that an army must be not only strong, but also intelligent. This combination made the Roman legions unique among all the armies of antiquity. Their effectiveness became legendary. The manipular formation, the interaction of different types of troops, and the flexibility of command became the basis of Roman military art. The Romans learned to use different types of troops in such a way that they reinforced each other. Infantry, cavalry, and light troops acted as a single unit. This system allowed them to respond quickly to changes on the battlefield. It gave them a huge advantage over less organized armies. The army became a professional tool of expansion. The Roman legions became not just defenders, but instruments of political influence. With each new campaign, they demonstrated their effectiveness. Their victories brought new territories and wealth to the state, and all this was laid down precisely after Zama. Carthage, although it remained a trading city, lost its greatness forever. Unlike in the previous era, when it was one of the richest centers in the Mediterranean, its influence declined sharply. It could no longer develop its fleet or maintain a strong army. This blow destroyed its role as a political player. Rome came to control the entire Western Mediterranean. Half a century later, it would be completely destroyed, but its fate was sealed at Zama. After its defeat, Carthage found itself dependent on Rome, which eventually became a death sentence. Any attempt to rebuild its strength was seen as a threat. Even internal reforms were perceived by the Romans as a potential danger. And when the moment came, Rome did not hesitate. Hannibal spent the rest of his life in exile, haunted by the Roman fear of his name. He had to leave his homeland to avoid being handed over to the enemy. He wandered from the courts of various rulers, helping them with his knowledge. But Hannibal's name remained a symbol of Rome's terror of the genius they had barely managed to stop. His life ended far from Carthage. Scipio Africanus showed that even genius can be defeated if its methods are carefully studied. He understood that it was impossible to simply repeat old patterns. Therefore, he did what ancient commanders rarely succeeded in doing. He adopted the enemy's experience and turned it into his weapon. This made him an outstanding reformer. His victory was the result of deep analysis. He did not simply copy the enemy's tactics, but adapted them to Roman realities. He understood that the Roman army had to act differently than the Carthaginian army. Therefore, he created a flexible management structure and emphasized the initiative of commanders. His decisions took into account the capabilities and limitations of the legions. This combination of experience and innovation was the key to success. It was a lesson that in war, the one who learns and changes faster wins. Scipio set an example that would inspire commanders in all subsequent eras. His approach proved that stubbornness without flexibility does not bring victory. Armies that know how to adapt always have an advantage. This lesson was particularly evident at Zama. The Battle of Zama also demonstrated the importance of allies. The Romans had long understood that diplomacy was as important a tool as weapons. Support from Numidia was a decisive factor. Without it, it would have been much more difficult for the Roman cavalry to resist Hannibal. This cooperation demonstrated the power of diplomatic solutions. The story of the Battle of Zama is a timeless reminder that no enemy is invincible. Scipio Africanus proved that intelligence, preparation, and the courage to break the rules can turn the tide of even the most hopeless war. Rome learned Hannibal's cruel lessons and turned them against their teacher, changing the course of history forever. What other great duels between military leaders would you like to see in future videos? Write your suggestions in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you can join us in uncovering the secrets of the past.